if our mind is open now to rethinking about money, the next presentation is all about how to think well about all of these questions, how to actually do the research ethically and responsibly. So we have Quinn DuPont with us from the University College in Dublin. And I'd say his paper is a pretty ambitious push to both analyze the state of ethical research and research in this space, and also actually present at least a beginning of what he thinks ought to be the principles we're using. The last thing I'll say is I think he brings attention to, very eloquently, that this is actually a really unique field to be doing research in, that we're not just studying valuable things like, oh, technology is valuable and interesting, but we're actually studying value itself, which is kind of more akin to bioethics or studying life itself. So with that, lots of responsibility there to do it well. Thank you, Quinn.
Thanks. And I would also just like to say before I start, thanks for especially to the organizers. I think it's really valuable that we really do have an interestingly multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary discussion here. So I'm going to be talking about ethics today, which is probably not a particularly popular thing to talk about, but just to kind of set the scene and so no one gets too upset, I'm not here to tell you as a researcher or developer how to do your job. I'm not going to say that you're doing it poorly or anything like this. This is really to try to motivate a discussion, I think, that we need to have for the health of the community, right? It's no big secret that the rest of the world kind of looks at the crypto world not very positively, right? It's just bad stuff over and over. So we need to, as a community, kind of start to think through some of our obligations here. There's discussions around law and regulation. These are important. Those I'm going to put to one side. They intersect with ethics in some sense, but I'm not going to discuss them. The other kind of just thing to kind of clarify here before I sort of get into my talk formally is that this is descriptive ethics. I'm going to kind of conclude with some sort of mild suggestions to start our thinking along these lines, but this is really a reflection of what the community has told me, and I'm sort of saying it back so that we can sort of talk through and discuss the kinds of issues that we're going to have to grapple with if we want to, you know, improve how the world thinks about us, right? So, yeah, so with that I'll start, and there's a bunch of challenges of doing the kind of research and development work that we do. Oh, the other thing I'll also point out is that this is not ethics generally speaking, this is ethics for research and development. So if you're a researcher, if you're a developer, have some interaction there, this is for you. So I'm not going to suggest whether or not Bitcoin is good or bad or what have you, but rather how we can do our job and how we can do it better, how we can do it more ethically. So the challenge is that there's not much ethical research on crypto. There's just really not. There's very few papers, and none of them talk about research and development. The extant guidelines we have, perhaps you belong to ACM, right? You might not know, but you have obligations, ethical obligations as being part of a professional association. University, MIT has, if you get funding from NSF, there's ethical obligations that come with these. The problem is they're pretty general, and they don't really seem to answer a lot of the kind of challenges that we're facing, right? Just for comparison, the journalists have had to deal with this. So in 2017, Felix Salmon sort of discussed this problem around some early journalists that bought Bitcoin when it was very cheap. All of a sudden, if they had hung on to it for a little while, they're in just a kind of, you know, prima facie conflict of interest, right? They have perhaps hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of, you know, assets. And so when they write about it as a journalist, that's a real problem. They have clear guidelines, however. New York Times, for instance, says unequivocally, if you're going to write on Microsoft, you can't hold Microsoft stocks. If you're going to write on Bitcoin, same goes. Okay? So, but we don't have that. So we have to kind of figure out our own, I'm going to suggest maybe bottom-up guidelines to help steer our ethics. So I'm not going to talk too much about the kind of methodology or whatever. Roughly speaking, I went through the literature and I did a survey. The results aren't particularly robust. Doesn't worry me too much because I'm not talking about, you know, causal properties here. This is norms and values, and so the numbers aren't huge, but that's okay. So there's a kind of truism in research and development ethics that our methods determine our ethics. And this introduces a lot of complexity into our ethical space because we use all sorts of different methods. As it turns out, most research papers don't include any discussion of methodology. In other words, a lot of what we write is arguably opinion. But putting aside opinion and looking at when people are discussing how they do their work, we sort of see here's a kind of a snapshot of what it looks, what methodologies look like, which is going to determine our ethics. And that sort of parallels some of the results from the survey I did for cryptocurrency and blockchain researchers and developers. So I'm going to kind of talk through some of the salient themes that the data provided. The first is that actually most researchers and developers do kind of understand they have these guidelines. However, really importantly, one of the sort of backstops of research ethics is IRB. In the US, it's called IRB. Most countries have some version of this as your institutional research boards, right? These aren't being used. There's lots of good reasons for this. There's a large tradition within computer science. Computer scientists don't like IRB for valid reasons. It's not applicable. The IRB boards don't know the kind of computer science methods. So it's not being used. But that's a problem, right? Because the IRB is supposed to be there to guide our research, and they're failing at that. Ethics is being taught in classrooms, somewhat. Not too many people using kind of formal guidelines, but maybe that's okay. Software vulnerability disclosure practices in general, I'm going to come back to this, is really problematic. But roughly speaking, you know, we're doing the kind of the thing that you're supposed to do. If you discover a security vulnerability, you disclose it. Here's a big one that is probably not really surprising to anyone, but is really problematic, and that is the kinds of conflicts of interest that are generated from token ownership and your disclosure practices. So as it turns out, lots of you who are doing research have assets, and they're not disclosed. That's a complex statement there, and I'm going to break that down in a minute here, because it's not so simple for us to say, well, don't buy, right? The no-coiner solution, I think, is actually not one that's going to get us very far. Interestingly, engineers, computer science folks, have been purchasing tokens for personal use, in other words, for profit, right? So very obviously, there's a kind of a conflict of interest here. That's just to give you some indication of some of the numbers. In fact, researchers and developers are earning profit, and they're not disclosing these the conflicts of interest. Similarly, with the industry relations, many of us sit on advisory boards and so on and so forth, and these aren't being disclosed. And I don't consider it a problematic feature of this space that research and development is tightly interconnected with industry. I think this parallels what we see in other sort of industrially aligned forms of research, that if you want to innovate, you need to have a tight linkage between the industry and the researchers. And it's definitely true here. We have that same sort of interesting problematic. The reasons as to why researchers are so intimately connected to industry are kind of various, but they're a little bit interesting. The number one reason is expertise. That's good, right? If you're going to be on an advisory board, hopefully you're there for your expertise. You're the professional. Unfortunately, reputation and your university's reputation were also cited as reasons as to why people think that they're being involved in industry, right? So it's no surprise if you come from a top-tier school, the industry is going to find you, and they're going to want to bring you on. Unfortunately, for not always just for the best of reasons. So I'm going to discuss 3 themes. These aren't the only sort of questions or themes that we could talk about. As I said, my interest here is just to kind of start to motivate this discussion. So the first one is conflicts of interest. So I think we have these conflicts of interest that are similar to other kinds of commercially aligned topics. So agriculture, pharmaceuticals, you know, these sorts of issues. We do have fairly simple guidelines for reporting thresholds for financial conflicts of interest. So you might not know, but if you have an NSF-funded research, if you have, you're supposed to do financial disclosures if you have more than the number is $10,000. You know, measuring exactly what you know is that spot price. There's a problem. It's a question as to how we sort of figure that issue out. However, the thing is, financial conflicts of interest are actually they're very prevalent, but they're kind of the tip of the iceberg. They're the part that is easy to regulate. You can just have a nice, clean number. If you have more than $10,000 worth of Bitcoin, well, then you should disclose it if you have NSF-funded research, right? Something like that. The problem, though, is that's not, there's a whole non-financial conflict of interest piece that is much more difficult to regulate and isn't always understood. So we saw back 20 years ago, the biomedical research journals had a fairly clear line. They said, if you have industry relations, you can't publish in our journal. But the problem they ran into very immediately was that there's no researchers left. Everybody has a relationship to industry. So we have the same problem. So that's not a good solution either. A publication ban, you know, is not going to work. We need something a little more sensitive. But we overestimate our ability to compartmentalize our ethical obligations, right? Like, we think I'm not biased. Of course I'm not. But we know it's just a fact that you will be. This is why pharmaceutical reps have steak dinners for researchers. It influences them. We know this. So it's a real challenge, right? There's also a kind of a halo effect that occurs. This is tapping into this idea, this challenge around reputation. So sort of strong evidence of this, we see the Nobel laureates. There's four, in fact, four Nobel laureates that work with industry, right? And I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to wonder why a Nobel laureate would be very influential for your company, right? And then on this issue, finally, there's an issue with what I call pay to play. For some research methods, not all, but for some research methods, it's unavoidable that you're going to have to get into a conflict of interest situation to do your research. So for instance, many types of active security measurements and these sorts of things, you'll need to, for instance, buy some Bitcoin if you want to manipulate a market, right? And that process of buying that Bitcoin will put you in a conflict of interest. Is it a problematic conflict of interest? Maybe, maybe not, but these are the sorts of things we need to puzzle through, and this is where the no-coiner solution, I think, doesn't work. So, the second issue is that a lot of the work we do is risky from a methodological standpoint. So, we have no existing guidelines, particularly. There are none that are specific. There are some that are slightly more specific. So we have, ethical guidelines from AOIR or ACM, or if you do security research, there's the Menlo report. So there are some, and they provide some guidance, but they're just not basically specific enough. As I talked about, the IRB is sort of failing us here, and this is often because a lot of the research we do doesn't have a human subject, and so it's actually a problem. You'll go to your IRB and you say, I need some ethical guidance here, and they're going to say, well, you don't have any human subjects, therefore you're exempt from this, right? And actually, to make tensions even more difficult, many of the journals are now requiring IRB as part of the publication process. Well, if you can't get IRB because you have no human subjects, you're not even able to therefore publish in the journal. So it's a bad situation. Then we have this whole kind of issue around the forms of the methodologies themselves. So consent is rarely possible, right? Usually these are anonymous sorts of mechanisms. Oftentimes, as part of research, many of the papers have sort of incidentally discussed that they exposed illegal activities, right? There are research participants who didn't consent to it, who are doing illegal things, are potentially being put at risk here. And this is one of the sort of fundamental tenets of research ethics, is you don't put your participants at risk. But we do this frequently. There is a high there's a high chance of research methods being misused or being reused. There's evidence, for instance, of national intelligence agencies and police forces going to researchers, and this has happened it seems to have happened in crypto, and requiring either data, hopefully not raw data, hopefully you've protected that, but that's an ethical issue, or your methods, right? Let's say you do some great de-anonymizing research. Well, it would be very useful for the police to come up to you and say, give us your de-anonymizing methods. And there's an ethical issue there, right? There's just this little image here is from the last CES, where Ari, with the best of intentions, he talked about, he said, we did this great research, but one of the kind of unintended consequences was after they published this blog post, you can see sort of in the very small in the graph there, that big spike is the number of bots that were generated as soon as they published their blog post on the fact that you can do bots, right? So they created that phenomenon. They created bots, right? And everyone jumped on it. And they weren't trying to do anything wrong. They were trying to just study it as good scientists might, but it was kind of one of these unfortunate consequences. And then, similarly, we have, here's a very unscientific poll from Twitter that asked whether or not it was okay to get students to break mainnet smart contracts. And most people thought it was. This is something, teaching your students about security is a complex, it's a thing, it's necessary. Students need to learn these mechanisms, but it's obviously ripe for abuse. I don't have much time left, so I'm just going to very briefly talk about the fact that our disclosure practices are basically not up to snuff, right? Disclosure in especially the security world is known to be, it's kind of our best practice, but it's not the best mechanism we have. Especially when you introduce the fact that disclosure might be the mechanism that protects billions of dollars worth of assets. It's not, disclosure is not a sufficient mechanism to ensure the safety. And then, as I said, the no corner solution is no good. So, as a kind of conclusion, the main issue I want to sort of discuss is that we're in a new kind of class of technology here. This is my kind of like my positive claim here, is that like biotechnology, which is about living things, right? Nanotechnology, very small things. We work with a technology that's about value, and it's very directly about value. If you hack a smart contract, it's just exactly like breaking into a bank, right? So it's that interesting property we have that is going to cause us all these sorts of challenges. We work with technologies of value per se. And so this is a complicating factor. And then just finally, I'll just kind of leave this one up here. This is just some get the conversation going. Here are some, I think, non-controversial, I hope, sort of guiding principles. Right? This is not a list that is complete. I think this is where the community needs to start to discuss what we need to do for best practices, and my sort of suggestion is we should start with bottom up. So labs and individual researchers should be having these conversations. What are our ethical obligations? And with that, thank you very much, and the paper is available, and come talk to me whenever, of course.
Wow, that was a lot in a short amount of time. Hell yes. Wasim, are you going to start off with a question?
So, are we on? Yes. So I am speaking not just as a researcher or a lab group member, but as a journal editor. And we are trying to develop a conflicts of interest policy for the journal. And every direction we've tried to go in, we've had pushback from some different subset of stakeholders. So we haven't managed to put anything concrete in place that goes much beyond the kind of no-corner solution, as you call it. So one of the issues we have is that if we are too stringent in the first place, it may create a chilling effect. So we're trying to bootstrap a venue here. We need to be somehow welcoming, try to build a big tent. If you put 10 wrought iron gates with padlocks around your big tent, nobody's going to come. So that's one of the issues we have there. We don't want to dampen researcher enthusiasm. The idea of having like a value threshold for disclosures is a bit tricky when you have extremely price volatile assets. So imagine you said $10,000 of currency X means self-report. Say that thing then goes up 100X. You've got a target on your head. So this is, again, we don't want to be like indirectly responsible for harming the well-being of researchers. One of the other things we've been thinking about is like disclose to who? Do we disclose to the public, or do we disclose to privately to the journal? And that obviously has some different kind of ramifications and effects. Obviously, you can do more if it's private, but then you're putting more trust in the journal staff, and we might not be to be trusted.
Wasim, I was supposed to interrupt long-winded question answer.
Yes, well, okay. So the question is, Quinn, can you help me write my conflicts of interest for my journal, please?
Awesome.
I have a couple of kind of just comments at best, and I really would like to just honestly hear what people have to say. One, disclosure is the kind of mechanism that we've, just as a society, researchers in general have come up with. It's not the best. It's just what we have, and it has these real significant limitations. We probably need to do it, but I think that's just the start. And I've forgotten all the other questions now.
Just tell me about the policy, Quinn.
Sorry, about policy, what you think, so I don't have an answer as to what a journal ought to do, but I will say, rather than just what ends up being a kind of pro forma disclosure thing, I actually favor what a lot of the cybersecurity journals are doing, like Usenix, for instance, right? They say you have to have a little section that is your ethical discussion, right? And it's everything. It's everything from, did you get consent? Did you go to your IRB? Do you have things you need to disclose? And I think it's not perfect, but it encourages people to think like, okay, if I'm doing research, I need to think at some point about the ethics of this situation.
That's genius.
So I think that's the start. And it doesn't need to be burdensome, right? And I think if we put these hard caps or anything, or you need to have IRB, we're going to introduce problems.
Great. Awareness. Next question.
Hi, yeah. Thanks for your talk. One thing that's interesting to me is I think in computer science in general, but I think in a lot of technology in general, a lot of the research is not done in academia. It's done out in industry. And so this thing like, oh, what happens if you sit on a board or you do this sort of thing? Okay, but what happens if you actually work for I work for a company. I do research, and in our field, as I said, in technology in general, but chemical engineering, right? All these fields have people working in the technology, and a lot of the things are being done there and can only be done in those places because they have the only funding. But that there's two questions. One is, you say disclosure. Well, clearly I work for this company, so I'm invested in that country. I don't know who else to, and we're not going to publish stuff that's bad for us. So, that's one thing. But another question to ask is not just like, what do I tell people of what I'm doing, but are there lines of research? A little bit along the lines you said about we unleash this bot army, right? Along the lines, are there things we should think, maybe we should just not try to do that? You know, like maybe we should think about if we do this thing, it might replace the entire financial system with something that is possibly unstable, and that could be terrible.
Thank you. Great questions.
I'll just sort of, as a comment, say I definitely think I think this is a vital sort of point, that I think we need big tent sort of solutions here. That definitely involves industry, and some technology, some parts of the technology industry do have and are increasingly, we're going to see more and more, internal ethical mechanisms, right? So really large organizations like Microsoft and stuff, right? Like these sorts of big, they have, sometimes they even have internal review boards, right? So they have these kinds of mechanisms, and I think that this is something that crypto companies specifically need to start to think about, generating these internal tools.
Thanks.
Awesome. I think if you have one burning question, but otherwise we'll get started with the next talk. Thank you so much. I don't know how everyone else is feeling. I'm feeling frustrated, hungry, wanting more time. I want to talk about these things in more depth. But I'm going to be grateful for what you offered and move on to Craig, who can come join me.